On a bright afternoon, Flight 682 was preparing for departure from the bustling Lexington International Airport. Passengers had settled into their seats, and the flight crew had completed their pre-flight checks. The plane was ready to head toward its destination, a direct route to Chicago. Among the passengers was an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Parks. She carried herself with quiet grace, dressed modestly, her silver hair neatly pinned into a bun. A small leather bag rested on her lap. To most on board, she seemed like any other senior traveler, likely visiting family or friends. To the flight crew, she was just another face in the crowd, at least for now. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the flight attendants began moving through the aisles, offering refreshments and ensuring the comfort of the passengers. A young flight attendant named Rebecca Monroe noticed Mrs. Parks seated near the back by the aisle. Her window shade was open, and she gazed calmly out at the endless stretch of clouds. Mrs. Parks' posture was upright, though there was a subtle stiffness in her shoulders, and Rebecca noted that her seat didn't recline. A row ahead, a small child wriggled and kicked at the seat back in front of him. Rebecca passed by but stopped on her second trip down the aisle. With a polite but clipped tone, she gently tapped Mrs. Parks on the shoulder. "Excuse me, ma'am," Rebecca began, tilting her head toward the child in the next row. "Would you mind switching seats? The little one here is causing some disturbance, and we'd like to keep things running smoothly." Mrs. Parks slowly looked up, her calm eyes studying Rebecca. She had traveled frequently over the years and knew well the minor inconveniences of flying. Yet, something about Rebecca's tone felt unnecessary. "I'm all right here, thank you." Parks replied, her voice steady but soft. Rebecca's expression tightened slightly. It was a simple request, and most passengers wouldn't have thought twice. Crossing her arms, she remained standing. "Ma'am, I'm not sure you understand," Rebecca said with forced patience. "It would really be easier for everyone if you moved to avoid any disruptions." She flicked her eyes toward the restless child, and then back at Mrs. Parks. "We can't have anyone causing a commotion." Parks held Rebecca's gaze without wavering, though her pulse quickened. She had no desire to argue. Offering a polite nod, she responded with the same gentle firmness. "I understand, dear, but I assure you I can manage just fine." For reasons she couldn't quite explain, Rebecca felt annoyed. Without another word, she turned and walked away, but not before muttering something under her breath. Something about people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. The flight continued as usual, but those who had witnessed the exchange whispered quietly among themselves. Some were unsettled by Rebecca's tone, while others dismissed it as nothing more than a misunderstanding. Regardless, it was clear that there was more to Mrs. Parks than anyone realized. Rebecca, however, hadn't the faintest idea that this was only the beginning of the story. What she didn't know was that Mrs. Eleanor Parks wasn't just another elderly passenger. And soon, Rebecca would discover that even the most unassuming individuals can hold more influence than anyone might suspect. A few moments later, Rebecca resumed her duties, moving up and down the aisles with trays of drinks and snacks. The earlier incident drifted to the back of her mind, though a slight unease remained. Difficult passengers were part of the job, and Rebecca took pride in handling such situations gracefully. Still, something about Mrs. Parks' composed demeanor lingered with her. As Rebecca approached the rear of the cabin again, she spotted Mrs. Parks gazing out the window. Her hands were gently folded in her lap, and she appeared entirely at peace. The child in front had finally settled, and the surrounding passengers were immersed in books or movies. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then softened her tone as she approached. "Are you sure you're comfortable, ma'am?" she asked, careful not to let the previous edge slip into her voice. Mrs. Parks turned toward her, offering a faint but kind smile. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," she replied with warmth. Rebecca nodded and moved along the aisle, but the curious feeling that this wasn't just another routine flight stayed with her, simmering just beneath the surface. Rebecca smiled politely at Mrs. Parks, though the tension between them lingered like an unwelcome guest. She was about to step away when Mrs. Parks spoke again, her voice soft but unmistakably firm. "I'd like to speak with the captain when you have a moment," Mrs. Parks said calmly. Rebecca blinked, caught off guard by the request. It wasn't often that a passenger asked for the captain, especially over something as minor as a seat issue. She glanced down the aisle toward the cockpit, unsure how to respond. Are you sure, ma'am? I can handle any concern you might have," Rebecca replied, hoping to de-escalate whatever this was turning into. Mrs. Parks' gentle smile didn't waver. "I appreciate that, dear, but I'd prefer to speak directly with him." Rebecca hesitated. Protocol was clear. Minor passenger issues didn't involve the captain unless absolutely necessary. But something about Mrs. Parks's composed yet unwavering tone made Rebecca feel like this wasn't a suggestion. "All right, I'll let him know," Rebecca said, more to move things along than because she thought it was worth the captain's attention. She doubted anything would come of it. Rebecca made her way toward the front of the plane, her mind racing. As she entered the cockpit, she found Captain David Morris reviewing flight data. "Captain," she said, leaning slightly inside. "A passenger in 27C asked to speak with you." Captain Morris raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" "No, not really," Rebecca replied, shifting uncomfortably. She was a little firm about it, but I'm sure it's nothing major, probably just a seating issue. Captain Morris studied Rebecca's expression for a moment before nodding. "I'll check it out. Better to be safe." As he stepped out of the cockpit and into the cabin, Rebecca followed closely, unsure why she suddenly felt nervous. Passengers subtly turned their heads, sensing something unusual. A quiet murmur ran through the rows as the captain made his way toward Mrs. Parks, who still sat peacefully by the window, as though she had all the time in the world. The atmosphere seemed heavier now, and Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Captain Morris greeted with his characteristic warmth. "I hear you wanted to speak with me." Mrs. Parks looked up and met his gaze with the kind of quiet confidence that made even the captain pause. "Yes, Captain. I'd like to discuss a few matters regarding the service during this flight," she said, her tone even but carrying weight that Rebecca hadn't noticed before. Rebecca stood a few steps away, watching with growing unease. There was nothing aggressive in Mrs. Parks' demeanor, no raised voice or sharp words. Yet somehow, the simple interaction felt more serious than it should have been. Then, something unexpected happened. Captain Morris extended his hand toward Mrs. Parks for her boarding pass, which she calmly provided. He glanced at it briefly, and that's when Rebecca saw it. His expression shifted. It was subtle, just the faintest flicker across his face, but Rebecca caught it immediately. The captain's usual relaxed composure tightened ever so slightly as he looked from the boarding pass back to Mrs. Parks. "I see," he said quietly, handing the pass back to her. "I wasn't aware." Rebecca frowned. "Aware of what?" Captain Morris turned to Rebecca, his voice lowered but unmistakably firm. "Rebecca, would you mind giving us a moment?" Her heart skipped. "Of course, Captain," Rebecca said, stepping back, though every instinct screamed for her to stay and listen. As the captain continued speaking with Mrs. Parks in hushed tones, Rebecca lingered near the galley, pretending to busy herself with trays while straining to catch even a snippet of the conversation. But their words were barely audible. What was going on? Captain Morris wasn't easily rattled. Yet here he was, handling the situation with a level of caution Rebecca had never seen before. Minutes passed, and finally, Captain Morris gave Mrs. Parks a respectful nod, returning her boarding pass carefully. Then he turned back to Rebecca, his expression unreadable. "Rebecca," he said with a tone that felt heavier than usual, "step aside with me for a moment." Rebecca followed him toward the front of the plane, nerves twisting inside her chest. When they reached the galley, Captain Morris turned to face her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you know who that woman is?" he asked, his voice low. Rebecca blinked. "She's just a passenger, right?" Captain Morris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That passenger is Mrs. Eleanor Parks. She owns the airline." The words hit Rebecca like a gust of wind. "What?" she whispered, barely believing what she had just heard. "She's not just any traveler," the captain continued, his tone serious. "She's the founder and owner of the company. She rarely draws attention to herself, but when she flies, she notices everything." Rebecca's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," Captain Morris cut in, though his voice wasn't unkind. "You didn't know, and now you've drawn the wrong kind of attention." Rebecca felt her face flush with embarrassment. The woman she had dismissed over a seat change could fire her, or worse, shift the course of her entire career. I didn't mean to disrespect her, Rebecca said quietly. Intent doesn't always matter, the captain replied. Mrs. Parks values humility and professionalism, but she also believes in holding people accountable. I'd keep a low profile for the rest of the flight if I were you. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Rebecca stood frozen in place, the reality of what had just happened sinking in like cold water. Mrs. Parks wasn't just another passenger. She was the most powerful person on board, and Rebecca had misjudged her entirely. Captain Morris led Rebecca into the galley, the soft hum of the engines filling the silence as he closed the curtain behind them. His usual easygoing demeanor had faded, replaced by a sternness Rebecca rarely saw. He didn't waste time. "Rebecca," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "do you know who that woman is?" Rebecca blinked, caught off guard by the question. "The elderly woman? In 27C?" she asked, her mind scrambling. "She's just a passenger, right?" Captain Morris ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "No," he said, locking eyes with her. "She's not just a passenger. That's Eleanor Parks. She owns this airline." Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. "What?" she stammered, gripping the metal handle of a nearby tray cart for support. "The owner? No, she can't be." "She is," Captain Morris replied, his gaze steady. "And you just tried to get her to switch seats over a child kicking her chair." Rebecca's face flushed hot with embarrassment. The woman she had so casually dismissed held the power to fire her, or worse, reshape the entire direction of the airline if she wished. I didn't know," Rebecca whispered, barely able to meet the captain's eyes. "That's the point," Captain Morris said, his tone sharp but not unkind. "You didn't know, and that's exactly why this is a problem. You treated her like she didn't matter." Rebecca's pulse pounded in her ears. Her thoughts raced back to the interaction, the impatience in her voice, the dismissive glance she'd given Mrs. Parks. She felt sick. "I swear I didn't mean to disrespect her," she said, her voice trembling. "But you did," Captain Morris replied plainly. "And Mrs. Parks? She's not the kind of woman who lets things like this slide." Rebecca's stomach twisted. "Listen," Captain Morris continued, his voice softening. "Mrs. Parks isn't the type to demand recognition or special treatment. She's flown on countless flights without announcing who she is. But she expects respect, not because of her position, but because she's earned it. And that's something you need to remember." Rebecca's eyes dropped to the floor, her cheeks burned with the weight of the realization. She'd prided herself on handling difficult passengers gracefully, but in this moment, she had completely misread the situation. I'll apologize," Rebecca said quickly. "I'll explain. Maybe she'll understand." Captain Morris shook his head. "It's not about explaining yourself," he said. "It's about realizing that every passenger, whether they own the airline or not, deserves to be treated with the same level of dignity." Rebecca swallowed hard. "Look, I don't know how this is going to play out," Captain Morris continued, "but if I were you, I'd steer clear of Mrs. Parks for the rest of the flight, and you'd better hope she doesn't ask to speak to management once we land." With that, Captain Morris turned and headed back toward the cockpit, leaving Rebecca standing alone in the galley, her thoughts swirling. As she leaned against the wall, the image of Mrs. Parks sitting quietly by the window lingered in her mind. How calm she had been, not once raising her voice or making a scene. Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. She had made a mistake, and she knew it wasn't something that could simply be brushed off. As the hours passed, Rebecca tried to focus on her duties, but every time she walked by Mrs. Parks's seat, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The elderly woman remained poised and silent, her hands gently folded in her lap as she gazed out at the passing clouds. Passengers had settled into their routines, reading, sleeping, or watching movies. But Rebecca could sense the subtle tension that still lingered in the cabin. Even the crew seemed to sense that something had shifted. Rebecca kept her head down, careful to avoid unnecessary attention, but she couldn't escape the creeping dread in the back of her mind. She had no idea what Mrs. Parks would do, but she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Rebecca's pride had blinded her to the situation, and now she had to sit with the consequences. As she passed Mrs. Parks's seat during her final rounds, she noticed the elderly woman no longer stared out the window. Instead, her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers gently folded over a magazine she seemed to be reading. A pang of guilt washed over Rebecca. She hesitated for a moment, unsure how to bridge the gap she had unintentionally created. What could she say to fix the way she had treated Mrs. Parks? Swallowing hard, she stopped by the row. "Ma'am," Rebecca began softly, her voice wavering as she glanced down at Mrs. Parks. I just wanted to apologize for earlier. I didn't realize who you were, and I was out of line." Her eyes darted nervously toward the magazine, unable to meet Mrs. Parks' gaze for long. "I'm truly sorry." For a moment, Mrs. Parks gave no indication she had heard the apology. She calmly turned a page, her expression unreadable. Rebecca's stomach twisted. She thought perhaps the elderly woman might simply ignore her. But then, without shifting her focus from the magazine, Mrs. Parks spoke. "I don't expect apologies from people who don't understand the weight of their actions," Mrs. Parks said, her voice smooth but edged with quiet authority. "But I do hope you take something from this and learn to treat others with the respect they deserve, regardless of age or appearance." Rebecca's head bobbed in a quick nod, her heart sinking further. "I will," she said earnestly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." A long pause hung between them before Mrs. Parks finally lifted her eyes from the page, locking her gaze with Rebecca's. "I believe you will," she replied. Her tone had softened, resembling that of a patient mentor rather than a scolding superior. "But remember, respect isn't a performance, it's a choice you make every day for everyone." Rebecca stood frozen, absorbing the words. She had braced for anger, perhaps even sharp criticism. But Mrs. Parks's response felt heavier, a lesson disguised as advice, one Rebecca knew she wouldn't forget. Before Rebecca could respond further, Captain Morris approached. His neutral expression masked whatever thoughts lingered beneath. He gave Mrs. Parks a small nod. "Mrs. Parks," he said respectfully, "we'll be landing in about 30 minutes. Is there anything else I can do for you before we arrive?" Parks smiled politely, shaking her head. "No, Captain. I believe I have everything I need," she replied. Captain Morris nodded and returned to the front of the plane, leaving Rebecca standing beside Mrs. Parks for a brief moment longer. Rebecca felt rooted to the spot, the weight of the interaction still hanging in the air. She wanted to say something more, to offer a better apology perhaps, but she sensed that anything beyond what had been exchanged would feel insincere. As the plane began its descent, Rebecca shifted back into her usual duties, though a lingering unease followed her. What was Mrs. Parks thinking? Would she let this incident fade away quietly, or would there be consequences waiting once they landed? Rebecca's nerves tightened with each announcement that signaled their approach to Chicago. When the wheels finally touched down, the familiar buzz of passengers preparing to disembark filled the cabin. Travelers unbuckled their seatbelts, retrieving their bags with excitement for the journey ahead. But for Rebecca, the energy felt distant, muffled by the anxiety that sat heavily in her chest. As she moved down the aisle to assist, Rebecca instinctively glanced at Mrs. Parks's seat. But Mrs. Parks was gone. Rebecca's eyes darted toward the front of the plane. Mrs. Parks had already gathered her things and was making her way calmly toward the exit, her small carry-on bag in hand. Rebecca's heart skipped. For a brief moment, she considered letting it go, allowing Mrs. Parks to leave without another interaction. But just as she tried to shift her focus, Mrs. Parks paused at the cabin door. She turned, her eyes landing directly on Rebecca. The faintest smile appeared on Mrs. Parks' face, but it wasn't warm or comforting. It carried something else, a quiet calculation, as if she knew something Rebecca didn't. Before Rebecca could gather herself to speak, Mrs. F. Parks approached. Her voice, though soft, carried the same weight as before. "I hope you've learned something from this, Rebecca," Mrs. Parks said evenly, "because while I believe in second chances, I also believe in accountability." Rebecca's stomach dropped. Mrs. Parks knew her name. How long had she been paying attention? Had she been watching the crew the entire flight? Rebecca suddenly felt exposed, as though every mistake, no matter how small, had been observed. Before Rebecca could respond, Mrs. Parks offered a final nod and continued out of the plane, disappearing into the terminal. Rebecca's feet felt glued to the floor, the reality of Mrs. Park's parting words sinking in. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't dismissive either, and that, somehow, felt even worse. As Rebecca resumed her duties and helped the last of the passengers disembark, the words echoed in her mind. Accountability. She could only guess what awaited her once the flight officially concluded. Before Rebecca could find the words to respond, Mrs. Parks continued, her voice steady but firm. "I'll make sure this matter is addressed," Mrs. Parks said, each word measured and deliberate. "I'll be reaching out to the senior management at the airline. I think they'll want to hear about what happened today." Rebecca felt her breath catch. Her heart pounded as Mrs. Parks' words sank in like lead. This wasn't going away. The apology hadn't erased the damage, not even close. Mrs. Parks was going to take action, and Rebecca could already imagine the fallout. The pit in her stomach deepened. "But ma'am," Rebecca's voice trembled as she tried to salvage the situation. Mrs. Parks raised a hand, cutting her off without raising her voice. "I understand you're sorry, Rebecca," Mrs. Parks said, her eyes unwavering. "But apologies alone don't undo harm. The people who will decide your future, those are the ones you need to consider now. And I assure you, they take respect very seriously." With that, Mrs. Parks gave Rebecca one final, pointed look before turning and making her way toward the front of the plane. Her steps were calm, deliberate, each one seeming to echo louder in Rebecca's ears than the last. Rebecca stood frozen, the color draining from her face. She had thought a simple apology would smooth things over, but it was clear that this was far from over. As Mrs. Parks approached the front, Rebecca could see the subtle shift among the crew. The way the lead flight attendants straightened. How the junior staff exchanged glances but kept quiet. Even those who hadn't witnessed the earlier exchange treated Mrs. Parks with quiet reverence now. Rebecca swallowed hard. Mrs. Parks wasn't making a scene, but her presence alone spoke volumes. Rebecca clenched her palms nervously. She couldn't just walk up to Mrs. Parks now and beg for forgiveness. That ship had sailed. If Mrs. Parks truly meant to escalate this to the higher-ups, Rebecca's position could very well be at risk. Her thoughts spiraled. She had embarrassed herself, but more importantly, she had embarrassed the airline in front of the one person who could reshape its future. As Rebecca tried to steady her nerves, Captain Morris appeared beside her. His expression was unreadable, but the weight in his gaze told her everything she needed to know. "Rebecca," he said quietly, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I suggest you stay out of Mrs. Parks's way for now. She's having a private word with the senior staff. She's not angry, but she's not letting this slide either." Rebecca nodded stiffly. The reality of the situation was settling over her like a heavy fog. Her attempt to make things right, it hadn't mattered. She had crossed a line, and now she could do nothing but wait to face the consequences. As the last of the passengers disembarked, Rebecca barely registered the routine process. Her hands moved automatically, helping others gather their belongings, but her mind was elsewhere. With each minute that passed, the weight on her shoulders grew. When the final passenger stepped off, the cabin fell quiet. The emptiness of the plane only made Rebecca feel more exposed. The crew moved around her, tidying and preparing for the next flight. But Rebecca remained near the exit, her pulse racing. She could feel the glances from the other attendants. They knew something had shifted. Mrs. Parks' calm but powerful presence had changed the air around them, leaving Rebecca standing at the center of it all. Captain Morris returned after speaking briefly with the senior staff. His face was the same unreadable mask, but when he stopped in front of Rebecca, she could sense the tension in his stance. "Follow me," he said simply. Rebecca trailed behind him, her heart hammering as they walked toward the cockpit. Before they reached the door, Captain Morris stopped and turned to face her directly. "Rebecca," he said, his tone low and serious, "you need to understand that what happened back there wasn't just about a seating dispute or a complaint. This is bigger than that." Rebecca swallowed hard and nodded, her throat dry. "You made a judgment based on assumption," Captain Morris continued. "You assumed Mrs. Parks was just another elderly passenger who wouldn't speak up, and now you've put the entire crew in a difficult spot." I didn't realize who she was," Rebecca admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have treated her like that. I understand now." Captain Morris studied her carefully, his expression softening just slightly. "It's not just about who she is, Rebecca," he said. "It's about the way we treat every passenger. Mrs. Parks could have been anyone, and that's the point. It shouldn't take someone's title for them to deserve respect." Rebecca felt the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. "I see that now," she said, her voice trembling. Captain Morris sighed, the edge of frustration still lingering but softened by a trace of empathy. "Look," he said, "I can't tell you what's going to happen next. But I do know this. Mrs. Parks isn't the kind of woman to make a spectacle. She'll handle this quietly, but that doesn't mean it won't have an impact." Rebecca nodded, fully aware of the weight her actions had carried. "For now," Captain Morris continued, "keep your head down, and when the time comes, take responsibility." Rebecca's heart sank further. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible. As they walked back toward the cabin, Rebecca knew she was only beginning to face the consequences. Rebecca's heart pounded as Captain Morris's words lingered in the air. "Mrs. Parks isn't someone who likes to make a scene," he continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "But she carries influence, and when she feels disrespected, she uses it. You crossed a line, and now the higher-ups are going to have to decide how to handle this." Rebecca's stomach twisted. The weight of his words pressed down on her. This wasn't just about the interaction on the plane. It was about her entire career, the reputation she had worked so hard to build. Captain Morris's tone softened slightly. "I'm not saying this is the end for you," he said, meeting her eyes, "but I need you to understand. Mrs. Parks isn't someone you can dismiss. She expects respect from everyone, regardless of their title, and that's not negotiable." Rebecca swallowed hard, nodding slowly. She felt like the floor beneath her feet had shifted. Before she could say anything, the cockpit door opened, and the senior flight manager, Laura Stevenson, stepped out. Her sharp eyes scanned the area until they landed on Rebecca and Captain Morris. "Captain, Rebecca." Laura's voice was brisk, her demeanor all business. "Mrs. Parks would like to meet with both of you in my office immediately." Rebecca's heart dropped. Mrs. Parks wasn't letting this slide. She had already escalated the matter. Rebecca's hands tightened into fists at her sides as she followed Captain Morris down the narrow aisle. Each step toward the terminal felt heavier than the last, the weight of her mistake growing with every breath. The walk to the office seemed longer than usual. When they finally arrived, Mrs. Parks stood near the window, her small carry-on placed neatly beside her. She was as composed as ever, speaking quietly with two executives who stood rigid, their expressions unreadable. Rebecca felt her legs weaken beneath her. This was the moment she had dreaded. Mrs. Parks didn't acknowledge Rebecca immediately. She continued her conversation with the executives, nodding occasionally as they spoke. It was as if Rebecca wasn't even there. The silence stretched on until Mrs. Parks slowly turned her attention toward Rebecca, her gaze cool and calm, but sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. "Rebecca," Mrs. Parks began, her voice measured, "I trust you understand the gravity of what happened today." Rebecca could barely force the words out, but she managed a soft, "Yes, ma'am, I do." Mrs. Parks studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Good," she said simply, "because I don't expect you to make the same mistake again. Respect, integrity, and humility aren't just buzzwords in this airline. They are the foundation we operate on. I expect those values to be reflected by everyone who wears this uniform." Rebecca nodded quickly, feeling her throat tighten. "I understand," she whispered, her voice strained but sincere. Mrs. Parks held her gaze for another moment before turning to the two executives beside her. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again," she said firmly. "There needs to be a shift in how we train our staff to interact with passengers, and I expect that to start immediately. No exceptions." The executives nodded without hesitation, jotting down notes. Though they had remained silent, their body language made it clear they understood the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't just about Rebecca anymore. It was about reshaping the airline's culture. Mrs. Parks turned back toward Rebecca. "I'll be leaving now," Mrs. Parks said softly, her tone less severe but no less impactful. "But I hope today has been a learning experience for you." Rebecca straightened, trying to steady her voice. "I've learned a lot," she replied quietly, "and I won't forget it." For the first time, Mrs. Parks' expression softened, just a touch. "I believe you," she said gently, before nodding once and exiting the room with quiet grace. Rebecca stood frozen as the door closed behind her, the silence in the office almost suffocating. She had faced stern reprimands before, but nothing like this. Mrs. Parks hadn't raised her voice or demanded disciplinary action, but somehow the weight of her words felt far more profound. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Rebecca went through the motions, filing post-flight paperwork, assisting with boarding for the next route, but her mind remained fixed on Mrs. Parks and the lessons she had just been taught. Rebecca had encountered managers, supervisors, and executives throughout her career, but Mrs. Parks was different. She didn't need to assert dominance or raise her voice. Her quiet authority spoke louder than any reprimand could. As Rebecca moved through her tasks, the image of Mrs. Parks lingered, poised, calm, and composed, while Rebecca had been the one who nearly lost control. By the time her shift ended, Rebecca felt drained, not from physical exhaustion, but from the emotional toll of the day. She knew she wouldn't forget this experience anytime soon. Rebecca's steps felt heavy as she left the terminal and made her way toward the crew room. The exhaustion she carried wasn't from the long flight, but from the weight of knowing she had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. As she entered, her eyes immediately landed on Captain Morris, leaning casually against the wall near the corner of the room. "Rebecca," he greeted, his tone more neutral than usual. "Can we talk for a minute?" Rebecca nodded silently, her stomach twisting in knots. She had anticipated this conversation, but now that it was happening, she felt unprepared. Captain Morris led her to a quieter corner, away from the small clusters of crew chatting or packing up after their shifts. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, his voice softer than she expected. Rebecca hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted, glancing down at her shoes. "I keep replaying what Mrs. Parks said, and I'm worried about what happens next." Captain Morris studied her carefully, crossing his arms as he considered his next words. "I get it," he said finally. "But you need to understand something. What happened today wasn't just about disrespecting a passenger. That's part of it, sure. But this is bigger than one mistake. It's about how we, as crew members, represent this airline. Mrs. Parks isn't just a passenger. She owns this airline. When things go wrong, she won't let it slide. Not because she's harsh, but because she believes in protecting the integrity of what she's built." Rebecca absorbed his words. She had heard plenty of company speeches about professionalism and customer service, but this time it felt different. It wasn't policy, it was personal. Her job, her entire future felt precarious now, hanging by a thread she hadn't even realized was there. "I get that," Rebecca said quietly. "I just don't know what to expect. Will I lose my job?" Captain Morris offered a thoughtful look, leaning slightly against the wall. "I don't know," he admitted. "Mrs. Parks hasn't made any decisions yet, but the fact that she didn't escalate things on the plane says something." Rebecca raised her head, confused. "She could have gone straight to the higher-ups during the flight," Captain Morris explained. "But she didn't. She's trying to teach you something, not end your career. That's important." Rebecca exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. Relief trickled in, but it was fleeting. "I guess that's something," she murmured. "I can't promise anything," Captain Morris added carefully. "But I can tell you this. How you handle this going forward matters more than the mistake itself. The senior staff respects accountability. If you take this seriously and show growth, that will mean something to them." Rebecca's mind raced. Was it possible to fix this? Could she redeem herself in the eyes of Mrs. Parks and the airline's leadership? I don't know where to start," Rebecca admitted, her voice small. "How do I make up for something like this?" "By owning it," Captain Morris said plainly. "You already apologized, and that's important, but the real test is what you do next. Are you going to step up, take responsibility, and learn from this, or are you going to shrink away and hope it fades?" Rebecca paused, turning his words over in her mind. He was right. The mistake had already happened. But how she handled herself from this point forward was entirely in her hands. "I'll own it," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "I'll fix this. I won't let it define me." A small, approving nod crossed Captain Morris's face. "That's the right attitude," he replied. "And trust me, Mrs. Parks isn't one to hold grudges. She's tough, but she's fair. If she sees that you're learning from this, she'll respect it." For the first time since the flight, Rebecca felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was a way forward. As they continued to talk, Rebecca found clarity inching its way back into her thoughts. She still didn't know what the outcome would be, but for the first time, she felt like she had a fighting chance. When she left the crew room that evening, the uncertainty lingered. She knew the fallout hadn't fully arrived yet, but at least now she had a sense of direction. In the days that followed, Rebecca tried to resume her routine. But no matter how much she immersed herself in her work, checking in with the crew, assisting passengers, and performing in-flight services, the weight of the incident never fully left her. Every time she heard Mrs. Park's name mentioned in company emails or caught whispers from fellow crew members about the flight, her stomach knotted. Her mistake wasn't just a personal blunder anymore. It was becoming part of the airline's internal discussions, and there was no escaping it. Rebecca's mistake had become part of the airline's story. Even if people weren't saying her name outright, she knew they were talking about her. The whispers during briefings, the side glances from other crew members, it was all a reminder of the moment she wished she could take back. But it wasn't until her next scheduled flight that she felt the weight of it pressing down. Before boarding, Captain Morris pulled her aside. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried something serious. "Rebecca, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. Her stomach flipped instantly. "About what?" she asked, though deep down she already knew. "Mrs. Parks called this morning," Captain Morris explained, watching her reaction carefully. "She wanted to check in, asked how you've been doing. She's following up on everything." Rebecca's heart raced. She's not firing me?" she asked, barely able to contain her nerves. Captain Morris shook his head. "Not yet. But don't mistake this for leniency. She's keeping an eye on you. Mrs. Parks isn't someone who forgives and forgets. She's the kind of person who tests character. She'll want to see if you're capable of handling responsibility the right way, and she'll make her decision based on that." Rebecca nodded, the sting of her mistake feeling fresh all over again. She had hoped Mrs. Parks might let it go, but that wasn't happening. Mrs. Parks wasn't the type to look the other way. As the plane took off, Rebecca found herself struggling to focus. She moved through her duties, serving drinks, smiling at passengers, but her mind kept circling back to Captain Morris's words. Mrs. Parks hadn't let the incident fade. She had actively sought out Rebecca's progress. This wasn't over. Halfway through the flight, as Rebecca was gathering cups from the aisles, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She discreetly pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was an email from the airline's HR department. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the subject line glaring back at her. "Follow up on incident." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as she read the message. "Dear Rebecca, thank you for your patience as we review the recent incident on Flight 682. We have taken into consideration the details of the situation, as well as the feedback provided by Captain Morris and other staff members. Based on our review, we would like to offer you the opportunity to discuss the matter further in a one-on-one meeting with Mrs. Eleanor Parks, who has personally requested this session. The meeting will take place at our corporate office in New York tomorrow afternoon. Mrs. Parks has indicated she is open to understanding your perspective and will provide feedback regarding your future with the airline. Please respond to confirm your attendance at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, HR Department." Rebecca's hands shook as she lowered the phone. A meeting with Mrs. Parks. This wasn't just a routine check-in or disciplinary follow-up, this was personal. A chill ran through her, but mingled with the dread was the faintest flicker of hope. Mrs. Parks hadn't written her off completely. If she was willing to have a conversation, there was still a chance to make things right. The rest of the flight blurred by. Rebecca could barely concentrate, replaying the incident over and over in her mind. She mentally rehearsed what she might say to Mrs. Parks, wondering if any words could adequately explain herself. How do you face the woman who owns the airline you insulted? By the time the plane landed, Rebecca's thoughts were consumed with the upcoming meeting. She knew this wasn't just about apologizing. It was a test of everything. her character, her growth, and whether she was truly capable of learning from her mistakes. That night, Rebecca barely slept. Anxiety gnawed at her, but beneath it, determination kept her awake. This was her shot, her second chance. She wouldn't waste it. The next morning, Rebecca carefully selected her uniform, smoothing out every wrinkle and adjusting her name tag. She wanted to appear confident but not arrogant, professional yet humble. By the time she arrived at the towering glass doors of the airline's corporate office, her heart felt like it might leap out of her chest. She took a deep breath, straightened her jacket, and stepped inside. Rebecca sat stiffly in the sleek, modern lobby of the corporate office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The cool air did little to calm the heat rising in her chest. She'd arrived early, hoping the extra time would steady her nerves, but it only seemed to stretch the weight of anticipation. Every time the elevator chimed, her pulse jumped, but it was never Mrs. Parks. This wasn't just about an apology anymore. Rebecca understood that now. It was about growth, taking responsibility, and showing she could carry the weight of her actions. The receptionist had greeted her politely, her professionalism making Rebecca feel even smaller. She hadn't asked any questions, only motioned for her to sit in the waiting area. The soft instrumental music drifting through the room felt out of place, too calm for the storm brewing in Rebecca's chest. After what felt like hours, the elevator doors finally slid open. Mrs. Eleanor Parks stepped out, tall and poised, her sharp black suit and upright posture commanding attention without a word. Rebecca didn't need to look twice. Mrs. Parks' eyes found her immediately, and Rebecca felt her breath hitch. She stood instinctively, her hands smoothing her uniform, but Mrs. Parks held up a hand. "Stay seated," Mrs. Parks said evenly. Rebecca obeyed, though every muscle in her body told her to keep moving, to explain, to fix it somehow. Mrs. Parks approached with the same quiet authority she had carried on the flight, her expression unreadable. "Rebecca," she said calmly, "I trust you're ready for this conversation." Rebecca swallowed, nodding as she rose. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, her voice tight. Mrs. Parks motioned for Rebecca to follow her, leading her down the glassy corridors toward a small private conference room. The space was minimal, no distractions, just a table, 2 chairs, and the heavy silence between them. As they sat, Mrs. Parks folded her hands on the table, her eyes locked on Rebecca's. "I'll get straight to the point," Mrs. Parks began, her voice low but firm. "You made a mistake on that flight, a significant one, and I know you're aware of it, but what I'm more interested in now is how you plan to move forward." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to hold Mrs. Parks' gaze. "I understand, ma'am," she began quietly. "I made an assumption. I treated you, and I'm sure others, without the respect they deserve. I regret it deeply. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know I've learned from it. I'm ready to do better." Mrs. Parks' expression didn't shift, but something about the way she listened made Rebecca feel exposed, as if every word she said was being weighed carefully. "I don't need another apology," Mrs. Parks said after a moment. "What I need to know is this: are you willing to change? Can you set aside your pride and become the kind of person who earns respect through action, not just position?" Rebecca's chest tightened. "I am," she said, the words tumbling out with quiet urgency. "I will. I know now that respect isn't automatic. It's something I have to show, every day, with everyone I meet, not just the people I think are important." Mrs. Parks leaned forward slightly, her gaze narrowing as if testing the weight of Rebecca's sincerity. "That's a good answer," she said at last. "But words are easy, Rebecca. What's harder is understanding the consequences of your actions. Small things, how you speak to someone, how you react in moments of frustration. Those create ripples, and those ripples can either strengthen the company or weaken it. One moment of carelessness can shift everything. Do you understand that?" Rebecca's throat felt dry, but she nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." For the first time, Mrs. Parks' features softened, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. "Good," she said simply. Rebecca exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "But understand this," Mrs. Parks continued, her voice regaining its edge. "Words won't prove anything. Actions will. That's why I'm giving you this opportunity. I want to see how you handle yourself moving forward. You've apologized, and I've heard you. Now I need to see what comes next." Rebecca nodded, feeling her heart hammer against her chest. "I won't let you down," she promised, the words firm but quiet. Mrs. Parks offered the faintest of nods, standing gracefully from the table. Rebecca followed suit, unsure if the meeting was over or if there was something more to come. As Mrs. Parks walked toward the door, she paused, turning back slightly. "I believe you, Rebecca, but belief isn't permanent. It has to be earned, and I'll be watching." Rebecca met her gaze, standing tall despite the knot in her stomach. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." With that, Mrs. Parks left the room, her footsteps fading into the hallway. Rebecca remained standing for a moment longer, letting out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The test had begun, and she wasn't about to fail it. Rebecca watched as Mrs. Parks left the room, her final words lingering in the quiet space. "I believe people can change if they truly want to. Don't disappoint me." For the first time in days, Rebecca felt a flicker of clarity. Mrs. Parks hadn't simply brushed aside the incident, nor had she let Rebecca off easily. She had given her something much more valuable, a chance to prove herself. As Rebecca stepped back into the hallway, her heart steadied with renewed determination. She wasn't going to waste this opportunity. One step at a time, she would earn back the respect she had lost. The following weeks passed in a blur of effort and reflection. Every flight, every interaction became an opportunity to show Mrs. Parks and herself that she had learned from her mistake. But it wasn't easy. Rebecca felt like she was being watched constantly, even when Mrs. Parks wasn't there. And maybe she was. Every word she spoke to a passenger, every small gesture, felt like it carried weight. This wasn't just about avoiding errors, it was about actively becoming better. She began noticing the little things she once overlooked, the way her tone shifted when she was tired, how often she brushed aside small passenger concerns, and how little she acknowledged the quieter crew members working around her. Now, every flight became a personal test. Rebecca greeted passengers with genuine warmth, listened more carefully to their concerns, and treated each moment as if Mrs. Parks herself was standing nearby. Slowly but surely, her efforts began to pay off. Captain Morris was the first to notice. After a long-haul flight to Denver, he approached Rebecca in the crew lounge, his eyes carrying the weight of observation. "You handled that well," he said, leaning back in his seat. "That passenger in row 12 was ready to cause a scene over their seat, and you turned it around. I can tell you've been taking this seriously." Rebecca smiled faintly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I've been trying. I know I have a lot to make up for." Captain Morris studied her for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not just about Mrs. Parks," Rebecca added quietly. "I want to do better, for myself. I don't want to just be good at my job. I want to be someone who earns respect in how I treat others." Captain Morris gave her a small nod of approval. "That's exactly the right mindset. You're heading in the right direction," he said, his voice steady. "Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing progress." Rebecca let his words sink in. For the first time since the incident, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. A few days later, as Rebecca was preparing for another flight, an unexpected email appeared in her inbox. It was from the airline's HR department. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the message, her eyes scanning the short but powerful note. "Dear Rebecca, we are writing to inform you that Mrs. Eleanor Parks has reviewed your performance over the past several weeks. She has been impressed with your progress and the changes she has observed in your approach to the job. Based on this, she has decided to offer you continued employment with the airline. Mrs. Parks wishes to acknowledge your efforts and looks forward to seeing you grow further within the company. Sincerely, HR Department." Rebecca read the email 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. She had been given a second chance, a real second chance. Mrs. Parks hadn't simply let the issue fade. She had seen the work Rebecca had done and chosen to recognize it. Relief flooded Rebecca's chest, followed quickly by pride. She had done the work, not just for the sake of keeping her job, but because she wanted to be better. For the rest of the day, Rebecca couldn't stop smiling. This was more than just professional redemption. It was proof that people really could learn, grow, and change. Rebecca stepped confidently onto the jet bridge, ready for what she thought would be an ordinary flight. The past few months had felt like a fresh start. Every shift was a reminder of how far she had come. She no longer viewed her days as just tasks to complete. Each interaction, every small decision, had become an opportunity to show that she had learned, grown, and truly changed. As she made her way into the cabin, Rebecca's eyes flickered toward the front row, and there she was, Mrs. Parks, the woman who had nearly cost her everything, but also the one who had handed her the most valuable gift, a second chance. Mrs. Parks glanced up, catching Rebecca's gaze. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was something different this time. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Rebecca straightened her posture and approached the aisle, her heart racing but steady. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Parks," Rebecca said with confidence, her voice warm but respectful. "It's a pleasure to have you on board." Mrs. Parks gave a slight nod, her sharp eyes softening just a touch. "Good afternoon, Rebecca. I see you're doing well." Rebecca's heart swelled. It wasn't just the words, it was the acknowledgement, the unspoken understanding that they both remembered how far she had come. "I'm glad to see you here, ma'am," Rebecca replied sincerely. "Thank you again for the chance to prove myself." Mrs. Parks' gaze lingered on Rebecca, measuring her with that same quiet intensity. "You've earned it, Rebecca," she said at last. "Keep it up." With that, Mrs. Parks returned to her seat, leaving Rebecca to continue down the aisle, feeling more at peace than she had in a long time. For the first time, Rebecca felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She was walking the right path, making the right choices, and steadily rebuilding the trust she had once lost. And this time, she knew she wouldn't make the same mistake again. Growth beyond the flight. The following months brought even more clarity. Rebecca's journey of growth, which had begun with a simple but costly mistake, had transformed into something far greater, a new way of living and working. Every aspect of her job reflected the lessons she had learned. She handled difficult passengers with patience and compassion, listened attentively to those around her, and treated every crew member, regardless of rank, with respect. Her interactions became more genuine, and the crew noticed. What once had been a frantic effort to prove herself became second nature. It wasn't about avoiding mistakes, it was about living the values she now embraced. Rebecca found herself mentoring new flight attendants, offering them the kind of support she wished she had known earlier in her career. She encouraged patience, understanding, and accountability, the same qualities Captain Morris had instilled in her. Her relationship with Captain Morris deepened as well. The once formal mentor-mentee dynamic had shifted. There was now mutual respect between them, partners working side by side to ensure the highest standards for their airline. One afternoon, after completing a routine flight, Rebecca and Captain Morris sat together in the crew lounge, relaxing as the last few passengers disembarked. The atmosphere felt lighter, almost celebratory. Captain Morris leaned back in his chair, offering Rebecca a rare smile. "Well," he said with a slight chuckle, "I think it's safe to say you've finally come into your own." Rebecca laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'd like to think so, but honestly, I feel like I'm still learning every day." Captain Morris nodded thoughtfully. "That's how you know you're doing it right. Leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about being willing to grow, even after you've been humbled." Rebecca's smile widened. "I guess I have Mrs. Parks to thank for that," she replied. Captain Morris raised an eyebrow. "She gave you the opportunity, but you're the one who decided to step up. Don't forget that." Rebecca took a deep breath, letting those words sink in. He was right. Mrs. Parks had opened the door, but she had walked through it. For the first time, Rebecca felt not just relief, but pride. Rebecca laughed softly at Captain Morris's words, though there was a quiet seriousness behind her smile. "I'm still working at it, Captain," she replied. "I don't think I'll ever stop, but I do feel like I've found my footing again. I'm in a much better place now." Captain Morris gave a small nod of approval, his eyes reflecting the journey she had taken. "You've come a long way," he said. "I knew from the start you had the potential to be great. You just needed to trust yourself and put in the work, and you did. Not everyone could have turned things around the way you did." Rebecca took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling over her like a warm blanket. She had worked hard, but she also knew how lucky she had been. Lucky that Mrs. Parks believed in second chances. Lucky to have mentors like Captain Morris who had supported her. Lucky that she had learned the value of humility and the importance of personal growth. It wasn't just me, Rebecca said thoughtfully. I had help. I've learned that we all need each other, especially when we make mistakes. The way the team supported me, the way Mrs. Parks gave me that chance, I couldn't have done it alone. Captain Morris smiled, leaning back in his chair. That's the right attitude, he replied. You understand now what makes a great team. It's not about any one person. It's about how we support each other, how we grow together, and how we lift one another up. Rebecca nodded, a quiet sense of fulfillment growing within her. She had found her balance, not just in her role, but within herself. She embraced her mistakes, transformed her mindset, and stepped into the responsibility of leadership, not just at work, but in her life. The following weeks passed quickly. Each day brought more confidence. Though Rebecca remained cautious, aware of the lessons she had learned, she no longer let her past mistakes haunt her. Her focus shifted. This was no longer just about Mrs. Parks' approval. It was about the kind of person she wanted to become, the legacy she hoped to leave behind. It wasn't long before her growth was noticed. One day, as Rebecca was preparing for a routine flight, she was called into the office by HR. She wasn't nervous, not like she would have been months ago. Rebecca knew she had earned the right to face whatever was coming with grace and humility. When she stepped into the office, Mrs. Parks was seated behind the desk. Beside her stood the HR representative, polite but serious. Rebecca's heart raced, but she kept her composure. Rebecca, Mrs. Parks said, looking up from a folder, I've been monitoring your progress over the last few months, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You haven't just restored the trust you lost. You've gone further. You've become a true example of the values we expect from every crew member. Rebecca blinked, surprised by the praise, but grounded enough not to let it go to her head. She had worked hard for this, but she knew the work wasn't over. Thank you, ma'am, Rebecca replied respectfully, her voice steady. I've worked hard to earn back that trust, but I know it's something I have to keep proving every day. Mrs. Parks nodded, a rare but genuine smile crossing her face. And you will, she said. But as of today, I'm pleased to offer you a promotion. I want you to step into a leadership role within the flight crew. You've demonstrated the qualities we value most: responsibility, humility, and a commitment to excellence. I believe you're ready. Rebecca's breath caught in her chest. A promotion. She hadn't expected it, not after everything that had happened. But there it was, a recognition of not just her hard work, but her growth. I'm honored, Rebecca managed, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for believing in me. Mrs. Parks' smile deepened ever so slightly. You earned it, Rebecca, she said. But remember, leadership isn't about having authority. It's about guiding others, showing respect, and inspiring those around you to be their best. Now go out there and continue doing what you've been doing. You're ready. As Rebecca left the office, her heart soared. She had come so far from that one disastrous flight. Now she had the chance to lead, to inspire the same change in others that she had experienced. Rebecca had proven that people could grow, that they could change, and that they could rise above their mistakes. And that, in the end, was the most powerful lesson of all. The first day in her new role. Rebecca's first day in her leadership role arrived sooner than expected. As she walked onto the aircraft that morning, everything felt different. She wasn't just another flight attendant. She was someone her crew looked to for guidance. There was a humbling weight to it, but also a sense of pride. Rebecca knew she had earned this. The flight was busy, but Rebecca carried herself with the calm confidence she had worked so hard to build. When a passenger had an issue with their seat, she handled it with patience and empathy. When one of the newer crew members hesitated during service, Rebecca stepped in, not to correct, but to guide. Every small moment felt like a chance to reinforce the values she now held close: patience, humility, and respect. As the flight neared its end, Captain Morris approached her near the galley, his expression light but sincere. You did well today, Rebecca, he said, his voice full of pride. I've been watching, and I can see how much you've grown. You're exactly where you need to be. Rebecca smiled, the weight of everything she had endured feeling distant now. Thank you, Captain. I couldn't have done it without your support. He chuckled softly. You've always had the potential, Rebecca. I just helped you see it. As the crew wrapped up their duties and prepared for landing, Rebecca took a quiet moment to reflect. The road ahead would still have challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. She had earned her place, not by erasing her mistakes, but by learning from them. And she knew this was only the beginning. Rebecca stood quietly in the galley as the plane touched down, watching her crew move through the familiar post-flight routines. But today felt different. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged, not just as part of the crew, but as someone they could look to for guidance. Rebecca had gone from the flight attendant who once made a critical mistake to the leader who could now help guide others through their own challenges. When a passenger had trouble with their seat assignment earlier, Rebecca handled it with a calm confidence she hadn't possessed before. She listened attentively, empathized, and found a solution without hesitation. When one of the junior crew members struggled with a task, Rebecca didn't step in to take over. Instead, she offered quiet encouragement and let them work through it, standing by as support. Each moment, no matter how small, felt like another chance to reinforce the values she had worked so hard to develop: patience, humility, and respect. As the last passengers disembarked, Captain Morris approached her, his expression warm. "You did well today, Rebecca," he said, his approval evident in his tone. "I've been keeping an eye on you, and I can see how much you've grown. You're exactly where you need to be." Rebecca smiled, a quiet but heartfelt gratitude filling her chest. "I couldn't have done it without you, Captain," she replied. "You've always been there, showing me what it really means to lead." Captain Morris chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've always had the potential, Rebecca. I just helped you see it. You did the rest." Rebecca's smile grew as she glanced back at the plane behind her. It was the same plane she had boarded countless times, yet today, it felt entirely different. Today, she wasn't just another crew member. Today, she was a leader. Recognition and responsibility. Later that afternoon, Rebecca returned to the crew room, greeted by the familiar faces she had worked alongside for so long. Her fellow crew members congratulated her, sharing kind words and light-hearted jokes. But behind their smiles, Rebecca saw something far more meaningful: respect. They knew the journey she had taken, the work it had required, and the humility she had shown along the way. This wasn't just about earning a title, it was about the transformation that had brought her here. As Rebecca sat down to catch her breath, the room quieted. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Parks. She watched the crew with that same composed, unreadable expression, but there was a spark of something else in her eyes. Approval. Maybe even pride. "Good job today, Rebecca," Mrs. Parks said as she stepped inside. "I've been hearing good things." Rebecca rose to her feet, surprised but humbled by the compliment. "Thank you, ma'am," she replied. "It means a lot." Mrs. Parks gave a small, knowing smile. "You've earned this," she said. "But remember, leadership isn't just about managing others. It's about inspiring them. Never forget that." Rebecca nodded, the weight of Mrs. Parks' words settling over her. Mrs. Parks had given her more than just another job. She had entrusted her with a responsibility, one that would challenge her every day, but one that Rebecca was determined to embrace fully. "I won't forget," Rebecca said quietly. "I promise." As Mrs. Parks turned to leave, she paused at the doorway, glancing back over her shoulder. "Good leaders know when to follow as well as when to lead," she added. "Keep that in mind." And with that, Mrs. Parks was gone. Rebecca stood for a moment, letting the room fill with the hum of conversation again. Mrs. Parks' words echoed in her mind, a reminder that leadership wasn't about authority. It was about trust. It was about standing alongside people, not just in front of them. The journey continues. As laughter and lighthearted conversation filled the crew room, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of reflection. The road that had brought her here hadn't been easy. It had been paved with mistakes, tough lessons, and moments of doubt. But now, standing on the other side, Rebecca felt ready for whatever came next. She had faced the hardest parts of the journey, and now the real work was beginning. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to lead. More than anything, Rebecca understood the most valuable lesson of all. Leadership isn't about having power over others. It's about the power to change, to improve, and to make the world a little better. One decision, one action and one person at a time. As she stepped out of the crew room and into the bustling terminal, Rebecca felt the weight of her journey lift. Her future stretched out before her, bright and full of possibility. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would keep moving forward. With every step, she was becoming the leader she had always hoped to be. And this time, there was no looking back.